and where you grew up and that kind of thing.
Hi, my name is Nirupa I am from India. I'm from a state called Tamil Nadu, which is in the south of India. I have been living in the United States for about 19 years now, and I came here when I was 18 to study. I went to college in Massachusetts, where I studied anthropology and economics. I think it was actually education that brought me here. India has an excellent secondary education system where you are trained very rigorously up until you graduate from high school, and I definitely am a beneficiary of that excellent system. But as it concerns tertiary education, which is college education and university, especially in the humanities and the liberal arts, you didn't really have that many opportunities because there's such a great choice that is available for Indians as it concerns engineering and medicine, but the humanities were never really such a huge focus when I was growing up. And I yearned to come to a country where I think not only could I benefit from a good educational system, but I certainly wanted to be trained in the liberal arts. And also growing up as a young woman, I think I frankly felt sort of stifled because India still was an exceedingly patriarchal society. And I think from very early on, I wanted to find my voice and my freedom as a woman growing up. And I think America seemed like the better place to find this voice.
I didn't have any.
So did I know what I wanted to be when I grew up? I think at different points in time, just like many people, I think I had some fanciful ideas. I certainly knew that I did not want to be an engineer. I certainly knew that I did not want to be a doctor. I was very interested in the arts and letters and the humanities. Originally, I think, even when I was starting out college, I had this idea that I wanted to go into development and really be helpful in assisting the lives of women and doing something that would empower women. I soon would change course. When I graduated from college, I was petrified about being poor because I'd come to this country with less than $500 in my pocket and I had no support system. My entire family was back home. So I quickly changed gears and I decided to pursue a career in financial services, which had nothing to do with my interest in anthropology.
Was your were your parents supportive when you wanted, knowing that you wanted to move? Was there ever anyone else in your family that had gone to the United States, and was there any impression about it?
Well, so I always had been exceedingly ambitious and driven as a child, and so my parents always had been very supportive of whatever I wanted to do in life. I certainly was the first person in my family to go abroad. My father actually didn't even graduate from college because he had to end his high school education to support his family. So for me, coming abroad and overseas, it was a big deal, and financially, certainly it was a big deal. It would not have been possible if I hadn't received financial aid from Smith College, which is where I went. I was possibly one of 5 people in the family that had traveled abroad at that time, so I'm certainly the first woman to go abroad. And at 18, I was so fearless. I didn't really think twice about picking up and leaving, and leaving all that I knew to start a new life. Looking back, I wonder if I would have had the courage to do it now.
And when you arrived, was it everything you expected?
It was everything and more. The America that I knew was largely the America that I'd read in books. I very early on as a young child had been part of this incredible relationship with a man that changed my life. He was our adopted grandfather in many ways. He was American, and Grandpa Gale used to visit the entire family every year or every other year, and Grandpa used to send me boxes and boxes of American books primarily. And so as a little girl, I grew up and was exposed to so much of America, just like American kids here were. And so I had this vision of what America would be. And when I landed here, it was absolutely breathtaking and spectacular to be here. You know, it was everything that I had dreamed about that I would see when I would grow up, and I felt so immensely grateful and liberated to be in a country where there could be much more open expression of everything, your desires, your interests, what you want to be. You know, it just seemed like there was no ceiling to whatever you wanted to be, you could be.
So you wanted to be successful.
I don't know what success would have meant then. I certainly wanted to be free. I wanted to be free to pursue whatever I wanted to do in life. I wanted to be in a system which did not have as many rules and regulations and labels on what you were as an individual. That was probably primarily my biggest impetus to come to a place like America. The second is I certainly was very much a serious student all my life, and I wanted to be part of a serious educational system where I could essentially lay the foundation and the building blocks for my life and empower myself to have the right tools such that I could go out and be a fully baked individual in society, you know. In India, I think that my avenues for expression of my creativity or the way I would have wanted to support myself would have been far fewer as a woman, I think, back then. Of course, things are very different now.
Did you have a fear of not going to be able to be financially successful? Did you have a fear of not having money?
Fear of not having money was not something that I was primarily preoccupied with then. When I started, I was on almost a full ride, so I knew that my expenses in college would be paid for the 4 years. I think the fear of security set in as I was getting ready to graduate, and then it became much more of a palpable decision that I had to just take. And of course, I was very pragmatic about it. It was pretty evident to me that I did not want to graduate with less than $1,000 in my pocket and not have a family. So the fear, it was not fear as much as just not wanting to have to ration out money that way, you know. I grew up in a very, very lower to middle class family in India. I grew up not having had a car or having any kind of fancy clothes to call my own. I grew up around a lot of money and wealth. Like the school that I went to, the kids were all like very wealthy, and I would always look at their lives and be like, perhaps it would be nice to sometimes have the good things in life. So I certainly knew that I didn't want to be poor. That was kind of my driving, that was a driver of my decision making back then. But I will say this, over time, as you make more money, I think you get used to more money, and then that's when I think all the fears set in. Now you're really resting on a crutch, which gets bigger and bigger over time, as you get more comfortable and more supported.
And so you just fell into the banking industry, basically.
I applied for an internship and I got in. I did a couple of internships. I
applied in the banking industry.
I applied in the banking industry and started my career on Wall Street. I started in 2002 as an analyst, and I worked on the trading floor. Yeah, I mean, did I fall into it? It was a deliberately chosen path at the time because I had done a couple of internships, but was I prepared for the trading floor and the rowdiness of it, and people yelling and screaming and money being moved around in vast quantities, and it was all very inconceivable to me when I started. But I'm an extraordinarily adaptable person, and I'm also very focused and diligent, so I just kind of worked my way up. I didn't really double guess it as to whether this was really me.
And how did you maintain your cool under stress?
I really was, I loved the chaos. I think I'm that kind of, I grew up in a country where there's so much chaos around you, In India, you're just used to some of the most extraordinarily ridiculous things happening around you all the time. So the trading floor for me was not very different. It was a very interesting and peculiar ecosystem. The stress was, it took some getting used to, because when you work on the trading floor, and if you make a mistake, what is at stake is millions of dollars. And I had to first get used to the idea that when you make mistakes, the implications can be vast, but yet you cannot be paralyzed by the fact that you're working with such vast sums of money. You just sort of have to get used to money being just a currency, and have to just get used to dealing with it like you're dealing with widgets. Because if you walked in every day and you said, I am transacting in hundreds of millions of dollars, I think you'll just not get up, because that kind of adds such a great degree of self-consciousness to having to deal with it. It was extreme conditioning in some ways. I think you just had to learn to become very quick in your comprehension and how you thought on your feet, how you were processing information, how you communicated with people so succinctly, because time was money. It was of the essence. You could lose a deal in a matter of seconds. So all of that, I think, was just extraordinarily functional training. It was like being in a video game at times.
And did you have any techniques that you used?
Everything that I learned was what I learned on the job. I very much would go to work every day very early. I was the first person in, and I was the last person out on my team, and I listened very carefully to a lot of things. I paid a lot of attention to what people are doing around me, and I learned by just shadowing them and following them and understanding the practice of that trade. It was a huge crash course in understanding human behaviors, and so you really, really, really had to listen deeply and observe, even as you're being bombarded with just vast amounts of information and stimulus. I would come home and I would be a diligent student, in the sense that I would learn up on the things that I didn't understand. I always went back and asked questions on things that I didn't understand. It was just, you had to be extraordinarily humble in not knowing anything and not being afraid to be a student all over again,
And did you practice anything like meditation or
I wasn't that evolved back then.
Breathing or anything like that?
I wasn't evolved. I didn't have a yoga practice back then. I actually didn't have much of a mind-body practice. Being on the trading floor was my meditation. I know it sounds strange to say that, but it was like when you're in a sport, you jump in the pool and you just have to swim. Or you're on the track, you have to just run. And that's where I was. And because of the nature of the job, because it was so all-absorbing and so stimulating, it wasn't hard to be present. You had no choice but to be present, So during on-job, it was a matter of being in an extreme flow, actually, rather ironically. But when you come back home, I think I was just wiped. And I think if I look back on those years, I wish I had had a better routine of setting boundaries between work and home, and decompressing and having the reflective practice when I came back home. I didn't have that. And I frankly think that on one hand, I was constantly in this go, go, go mode. I was in this constant achievement mode when I was working in finance. I didn't know how to slow down. And in fact, because I didn't know how to slow down, I think that's why my career followed the trajectory that it did. But what that ended up doing was it added up. So when 2008 and 2009 happened, and the financial crisis happened, I look back on like the last 7 years, and everything just was extraordinarily a blank, because I just had been running so fast, and suddenly when everything came to a crashing halt, I just didn't know what to do with myself. It all seemed a little bit pointless, if you know what I mean.
And when you were growing up in India, were you familiar that people did yoga, or was it like this old-fashioned thing that nobody in your family did or people around you did?
Ironically, growing up as an Indian and I wish I'd been more immersed in the yoga practice. My father was a very devoted practitioner of yoga. So I would wake up every day to see my father practice yoga. So it ran very much in the family. Did I do yoga as a kid? I hated it. I really did not like doing yoga, and every time my father would make me do it, I would do it very grudgingly. And I think yoga was actually not taught the way I think I was able to absorb back in India. In fact, I still go back to India these days and I never find the pedagogy that I want, you know. My best yoga classes are always, for me right now, out of India. So my real love for yoga only developed right actually after the financial crisis. I think it came from a real interest in wanting to reset everything and come back to center because I felt like I'd lost everything. And so my first interest started with Pilates actually, because whenever I tried to do yoga, I found that I wasn't strong enough to support myself. So I had to go back and pursue a discipline where I learned things about the core and how to engage your body first, and before I went back to yoga. Ironically now I practice more yoga than I practice Pilates, even though I'm trained in Pilates. But yoga really found me, I think, much later.
When was it the first time you took a Jivamukti class?
If I remember correctly, it was within a few months of when the studio opened in Jersey City.
Okay. Do this
Actually, that's not true. Sorry, let me take that back. I had inadvertently attended a Jivamukti class in Frankfurt, Germany. And at that time, and this was many, many years ago, it was probably at least 5 years ago, and the woman talked about Jivamukti, I had no idea. All I knew was that the chanting was interesting and the use of music was interesting. And then, you know, Jivamukti opened up here in Jersey City, and I'd been looking for a good yoga studio because all the while I'd been practicing yoga in New York where I worked, Manhattan. And I was always, you know, fussed about the fact that we never had a good yoga studio in Jersey City. So when Jivamukti opened up in Jersey City and I saw the incredible menu of classes that were available, I'm like, now here is a serious yoga practice. And I committed to it. So that must have been, what, 2 years ago? Bobby, I don't remember when the studio opened in Jersey City, so. 3.5 years ago. That was when I took on Jivamukti very seriously. I was coming out of 2 years of Ashtanga, and I was really burnt out by Ashtanga. I think the practice of the Mysore practice was, as much as it set a great foundation in breath, I found that the Ashtanga practice was not for me as a woman. The exercises and the repetitions, I think, were frankly wearing my bones down. It was, you know, there was an acute onset of tendonitis. So it was really wonderful to discover, you know, a different module and, you know, a different system, which was very related. But, you know, Jivamukti for me actually fires off on a few different cylinders that Ashtanga was not for me.
And then when you started, did you were you able to use that in your job to find any calmness or peace, or were they totally separate?
I think Jivamukti was probably the first proper integration for me of the spiritual practice of yoga. Up until then, it had largely been a mind-body practice. There was nothing of the heart and the spirit for me as much. So as soon as there was a much more conscious practice of philosophy, spirituality, music, and bhakti, very much within the format of the class itself. It's not something that you were doing homework on the side, you know what I mean? That integration happened through Jivamukti, which in turn then started manifesting in different parts of my life. Did I consciously feel that at work every day, or no? I don't know that I did. I'm sure it was happening behind the scenes, but I will say that some of the bigger attitude shifts that were happening behind the scenes for me, which prompted me to be where I am today, I think really frankly was the yoga practice. It was a very conscious movement towards my own truth. And before I started practicing yoga, especially through the Jivamukti practice, I think that kind of seeking and that kind of inquiry was not so pronounced in me. it was obviously going through the back of my head probably, but it wasn't at the forefront of my brain. It wasn't certainly in the forefront of my heart practice.
So when did you feel that you were actually beginning this inward journey?
Last couple of years, I think, but it also coincided with a lot of suffering in my own life, personal life, because I ended up, separating from my partner for almost 18 years, and that was life altering for me. When I had that vacuum of a relationship that had been a fundamental building block of half my life, I had a lot of questions and no answers. There was a gaping hole inside. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know how I belonged, where I belonged. And so therein began the search for who am I? What makes me wake up every day? What do I look forward to? And it was a time when I actually was pretty lost, and I think coming to the yoga practice every day was extremely grounding. And having that, I think, changed it for me. Having that center, having been able to go to the mat and not having to think about anything else, that was the beginning of it. And then I think the shift started happening, like once you trusted your practice and you come to your mat every day, regardless of how crummy you were feeling, then you build trust in yourself and you slowly start the process of healing. And then it was just building upon it.
And so what defines this inward journey now for you?
I think I am looking at the role, I'm looking at myself and what purpose do I serve in society, and that's my inward journey. This is now a time for me where I'm constantly reflecting on how am I going to give back? What can I do to return back the incredible graces that I've been the beneficiary of? So it's a very explicit movement for me away from being preoccupied with what I've achieved as an individual to
Precise definition of God or what something greater than yourself? Have you been able to put your finger on that?
I haven't. I have a very confused relationship with God in the sense that I certainly am aware that I'm part of something much bigger and vaster that's way beyond my comprehension and conception. And I have a deep, abiding respect for that. I've always chafed against organized religion, so I've never really considered myself a practitioner of religion in that sense. Growing up, my mom was definitely a devout practitioner of Hinduism. My father was actually an atheist, but as he's gotten older, he's become much more religious from the standpoint of at least being more ritualistic. I am a spiritual person, though. I'm drawn to temples not because of God. I'm drawn to temples because of the energies that reside within. I'm drawn to the myth and the mythology of it. I have a fundamental respect, and I believe in the truth and the beauty of all living things and all the inanimate things that we're not aware of. I have a deep respect for the various forms of consciousness, but a God, I don't know how to think about God. I really don't. I'm unfortunately one of those people that has felt that religion has been abused in so many ways, and I find it very hard to separate from how religion has been used as an instrument of persecution and oppression. But yet there's so much beauty and truth that lies in some of these scriptures and in the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads and all of this. I like some of the practitioner aspects of these, but yet I think I chafe against religion as a label and God as a label.
Have you been able to study any of the scriptures or the yogic traditions, Patanjali, Bhagavad Gita, some of the stuff you grew up with? Have you looked back and opened some of those texts up and looked into them?
Yeah, it's interesting. As it concerns scriptures, and I was educated in a school called Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, which is one of the primary institutions within India where they inculcate or cultivate Sanskrit and Hinduism. So growing up in assembly, we would chant all these shlokas, and I loved chanting. I loved Sanskrit as a language. So growing up as a child, I did learn the Gita. I did study the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and all of that. The fascination for me was not in the stories or in the mythology then. It was more in the chanting and the beauty of Sanskrit. Patanjali, actually, ironically, I didn't pick up a book on the Yoga Sutra until I started practicing Ashtanga. I've not entirely finished a book on the Yoga Sutra, but the interest is there. And in fact, I'm actually going for a course in India later in November that is largely just about yogic philosophy and studying the scriptures. And I think now that this year I've taken off, I've also committed to the fact that I'm going to go back to relearning Sanskrit, and using that as an avenue to go back and study some of the incredible philosophy and scriptures that come from my country. So the interest is there.
Mm-hmm.
I've just not committed the time, and I suspect that I will commit more and more time now toward it.
And what message do these scriptures have today for this modern life where things are so different than back then?
That's such a complicated question, Bobby. You're asking me to condense the vastness and profoundness of texts that were written like thousands of years ago. The one thing that I will say, and I'll riff a little bit off the Gita, right? Because this is the first thing that popped up in my head, is the concept of the dharma, right? What is your calling? What is your place in life? And in some ways, I think the Gita talks so beautifully about what is your dharma, because Krishna sits on the chariot when Arjuna is having a moment of trepidation, whether he should set out to war and go and kill his brothers or his cousins, the Kauravas. And Krishna reminds him that it is his dharma to go out there and fight. And so right now am preoccupied with what my dharma is. What is my calling? What is the right thing that I should be doing with myself at this given point in time? And I think that one of the most resounding things that we all should be thinking about, that we can take from these ancient texts, is what is your dharma? What is your truth? What are you meant to be doing right now? What is your path? Because we all have one, It might not be the same every year, but I think that certainly the sense of purpose and meaning comes from what is a purpose that we fulfill any given day or any given hour, So that's what I would say. I think that is my lesson that I'm choosing to embrace this year, and I certainly hope that the universality of that lesson is able to transcend to cultures all across in this day of extreme fear, extreme alienation, and extreme fragmentation. Because if each one of our dharmas is to be a human being and to be a good human being at that, I think we wouldn't really be where we are right now.
And do you think by finding what your dharma is in life makes for happier people?
I certainly think that I haven't found it yet, but I know that even as I'm setting myself on the path of finding my dharma, I already feel like there's so much more clarity in the way I am even going about every day. There's a certain sense of lightness, because as much as I don't know where this is going to lead me to, I know that I'm walking towards finding my path of purpose, and I know that I'm going to find meaning at the very end of it. I don't know that happiness is going to be the goal here. I think it's going to be freedom. I keep coming back to it. I think that when I do find my dharma, I think there's going to be a great sense of relief, because I know that is what I should do, and that's what I am doing. A great sense of heaviness would be lifted.
And how did this journey that you're on now, this traveling around, fit into that? What activated that? Was it your search for your dharma?
No, you know what is interesting, right? Travel has always been sort of I was an anthropology major, right? So travel has been my method of field study. Travel is very deep rooted in my family. I come from a family of travelers. We've all been sort of nomadic at different points in our lives. My father traveled intensely all over India. My uncle was a traveler. So I've always been a traveler since I was very young. Even though it was not outside to fancy locations, we always knew that travel expanded your horizons and travel was an intense medium of growth, you know? So for me, when my job ended, my career in finance ended last year, at least the way I've known it, I immediately knew that I had to get out there and travel. Why? Because I knew that this was going to be a period of intense inquiry for me, a period of a lot of growth. And I couldn't think of a better way to do it than to get out there and get out of my zone, my comfort zone of Jersey City, my little bubble where I knew where everything was, you know. I needed to get out there and once again push the envelope was what was not known to me and what was not familiar to me. I've always been a student, and I think that travel for me is like real life university. There's no better way to learn about yourself, about life outside, about realities that you didn't know existed, except through travel. That's my method. I always fall back on travel. Anytime I want to, anytime I'm feeling restless and I'm fretting a little bit, it might be a little weekend trip that I would do, that I always pack my bags and go out and just kind of get out of the zone. To really just jolt myself a little bit, if you will, because what meets you outside your home and constantly also testing the boundaries of what home means, I think, for me, almost always gets me into this mode of creative thought. It gets me into this mode of exploration. And I think I'm happiest when I'm in that mode of creation and exploration.
Do you have a regular meditation or quiet routine that you do when you travel?
Meditation when I'm traveling has not been formally there. I will say this last bout of traveling that I did was the longest in a very long time. It was about 2 months and 2 weeks, and I found myself vastly disoriented and discombobulated because I was in different cities almost every 3 or 4 days. So I started sitting down. I actually had a huge problem sitting still. So meditation always has been a bit of a challenge for me. But towards the end of my journey, when I was starting to fall into some kind of a rhythm, even though I was in different places at times, I was able to sit. I was able to sit still. But for me, the bigger meditation actually was to be in the moment when I was traveling and just absorbing everything around me and just digesting and making sense of it. You know, that was also like being in flow in some ways because you were constantly in motion. So it was like yoga. You know, I was walking down a new street every day. I was talking in a different language or trying to understand a different language every day. So meditation came from travel. But as soon as I got back home, I was able to sit, even for a few minutes, you know. It has been writing that has actually brought me back to a little bit more of a meditative state, more so, in that kind of sitting kind of meditation.
Do you write a lot?
I've been writing a lot more. In fact, this year I very audaciously set myself this project of just writing a book. I've always written, I've always loved words. Again, words and letters there's a deep tradition of that within my family, with my grandfather and both my paternal grandfather and then Grandpa Gale, who brought me books from America. I've always known that I loved writing, but I never pursued it. I studied literature in India before I came to Smith here. I didn't study literature here. So I'm writing this year. I'm writing all kinds of things. I write when it comes to me. It's become one of my primary modes of expression and articulation. And it's been by far one of the most meditative things that I've done. It's made me much more deliberate and much less restless.
Did you miss not being able to practice yoga when you were?
One of the unhappiest things when I was traveling was not having my yoga practice, not having the studio, not being able to just come and roll my mat down and be with a teacher that I've known. I practiced, as you know, I did live streaming on Jivamukti when there were areas with good Wi-Fi, but of course I was traveling in countries where at points there was no reliable Wi-Fi, so that was not an option. I missed it immensely. I felt like felt less whole not having practiced yoga. I didn't practice yoga for 3 to 4 weeks, and when I came back, the first thing that I did, was obviously to, come to the studio and do my 6:45, spiritual warrior class.
Okay, let's go where we left off.
Okay, so do I miss yoga and the studio when I travel? Yeah, I miss it tremendously. I always feel very disoriented when I don't get the chance to practice yoga 2 or 3 times a week at least. And also the studio in Jersey City is rather special for me. I can remember days when I would actually literally land from the airport when I was working, and after a business trip, I would, walk in with my suitcase to the studio because that's how much I missed it. For me, as much as this year is about testing my limits and pushing myself to be out there and do things that are unfamiliar and be in territory that is so unfamiliar, at the end of the day, I do like to come back to a certain sense of center. And for me, in addition to my home, the yoga studio actually is sort of one of the centers for me where I'm able to come back and immediately ground and be able to be rooted again.
And do you, when you're traveling, do you experience lots of unexpected things?
I mean, everything about travel is always so full of surprises. I mean, the first thing is you just have to suspend any assumptions that you have any control. You have no control. For a second, you also are a guest everywhere you go. So you are at the mercy of other people's hospitality and the kindness of strangers, right? So I would say everything is sort of unexpected. On this trip, I've had to change course a few different ways, and I couldn't be hyper-planned the way I'm normally, which is I couldn't be someone from New Jersey or New York wanting to know everything 2 to 3 weeks ahead of time. Sometimes things would just happen on the cuff, and you just adapt and you move, and you don't think about it. Also, I think I was traveling through countries where people were not as fussed about planning and being, organized and having a schedule. I had no schedule. I pretty much woke up every day and I would make up my schedule as I go along. I didn't have to think about putting stuff on my calendar. And sure enough, like one week before I come back, and I'm like, I'm coming back home, and I have all my friends that I'm trying to connect with and people that I want to talk to. Sure enough, my calendar starts filling up. And so this concept of scheduling time also is so vastly different across cultures. And that's one thing that I think I didn't miss about having a calendar bustling with appointments and reminders and things like that. I liked the unexpected. I really did.
And how long do you think you're going to continue this?
I think that I have set aside this entire year in terms of time. So far, I've self-funded my travel, and of course, I don't think that I have an infinite bank account to bankroll this. So I would like to find ways to continue to travel for the rest of the year, because I am using this travel as a way to gather material for this book project that I had mentioned earlier.
Do you think you'll go back to the banking industry?
Not the way I'd known it, I don't think. But then again, I know that I should never say never. I think 14 years was a good amount of time. I gained a lot from that training. I'm now in a very different mode. I want a couple of things. One, autonomy of time. And you're never going to get autonomy of time when you work in the banking industry or for any kind of organized corporate model. The second is I increasingly also want to pursue much more of an avenue of creative thought. And as much as I think I'm very pragmatic that being a creative is extraordinarily distressing at times, definitely financially, I want to figure out a way to retool and use my existing skill set, but yet be able to give myself a chance to grow in a more creative and entrepreneurial way. I don't know yet what that's going to look like, how that manifests. So I'm spending a lot of time this year, in addition to traveling and gathering for this book project, I'm doing what design people call prototyping. I'm interviewing a lot of people and finding out what they do for their jobs and how they live their lives. I think my job in the future is going to look like that. It's going to look like a compendium of things. It's going to be about what I choose to do with my time. Of course, I have to earn money, but I suspect it may not just be one thing. It could be a mishmash of 2 to 3 different things that I might do. And I wouldn't look at it as a job as much as the way I want to be engaged with time and be productive with time, and how I'm engaged with my own expression, and then how I'm, of course, using it to survive and to lead a fruitful and well-lived life. A career, I think, is going to mean many, many different things going forward.
So this is going to, I don't know if I'm going to run out. Let me just see what's going to happen in 8 seconds. We got a lot of good stuff, I think.
You did?
I do.
I was kind of rambling, but
Well, that's what interesting.
of people and entrepreneurs, inevitably I was running into people that were practicing yoga. In Thailand, I did a couple of classes in Chiang Mai, in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh. I practiced with a really amazing woman that taught me not only Iyengar, but she also introduced a different module of yoga whose name that I'm forgetting now. It comes from Australia, and so those were 2 distinct times when I practiced yoga, and I met with really solid yoga practitioners, if you will. I did a lot of hatha, and in fact, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, the very beginning of my journey, I went and attended a yoga retreat in Rishikesh with an amazing Canadian instructor named Justin Haley. So that was the beginning of my journey. In fact, it was a very fitting start to my journey. Unfortunately, over the last 1 month, I fell into injury a little bit, and I wasn't able to practice yoga for that reason. But I bumped into people that were very serious about their yoga practice along the way. And a lot of them, just like me, I think almost always found there to be a grounding element of yoga and yoga studios and finding community in every place that you go.
Did you have any adverse reaction coming back with all the political stuff going on, and what are people saying about America abroad?
I had not read the news for about 5 weeks. I chose not to read the news when I was abroad, and I would pretty much just hear about what was happening in America. It was curated by my exceedingly intelligent and well-read friends that I stayed in touch with via Facebook. Of course, the reactions of people all around where I traveled, it certainly was anything from horror to amusement to just ridicule at times. It was hard, and I actually, frankly, just took a step back and didn't engage in some of the political conversations, because a lot of them were, it was not just debate, it got heated at times, and it wasn't very productive for me to be engaged at that point. It was the Americans that I bumped into abroad, the expats. Obviously, they were all a bunch of liberals and creatives and social entrepreneurs, so you know that they were probably very left-leaning. They were the harshest in their denouncement of what is happening back home. And it was, the anger, the sense of anger was just palpable amongst the expat community. The sense of shame as to how we've completely reversed, I think, centuries and centuries of what this country has represented. That was pretty remarkable. I was dreading coming back home. I was not looking forward to coming back to America. I didn't know what lay await at the border. I'm a green card holder. I'm not a citizen. I've lived here for 19 years. And yet, when you sign those forms and you're an alien, a non-resident, a resident alien, even the terminology kind of just it just cheeses you off. It makes you feel like you don't belong here, But sure enough, I crossed, and I didn't have any problems through immigration or anything, but I was not looking forward to coming back. I'm happy to be back now that I'm here. I still haven't read the news. I don't want to go back to the news for a little bit.
And do you find a sense of community when you go into the studio and practice with other people?
Absolutely. I think that Jiva Mukti, the studio, the practitioners, the teachers, each one of them, I think, are extraordinarily special. And every time I come back, it is not just about coming to the mat. It is about being connected to that group of people who have chosen this practice, and a group of people that I think have a deep sense of community. I think the one good thing that I think Bobby, you and Austin have done is to encourage the community to be involved with the studio and to organize events and such, where you are increasing not only outreach but also bringing in people from other backgrounds into the studio. So to me, it seems like constantly a center that is there, where there is a reciprocal exchange of information and ideas and practices, and that's a real community.
And did you, going back to the journey and did you find that did you experience people that were deeply connected when you were to this divine presence, or this greater than ourselves presence when you were traveling? Did you find people had found their dharma?
I bumped into people that were on similar paths that I was. Perhaps it is always a self-selection, right? You seem to attract and gravitate towards people that are sort of a similar creed, if you will. And so, yeah, this year has been a year of transition, and so naturally I was bumping into people that were similarly transitioning out of a life that they had known into something else. And of course, the underlying theme for a lot of them was trying to find themselves, or it was about finding their called work. It was about where am I going to live next, and how do I want to spend my time, and how do I want to be engaged with this world. So there was a lot of people like that. Did I meet anyone explicitly religious, even though I traveled through some very devout Buddhist countries? I did not really. I bumped into people that were more spirituals and creatives and who found dharma in their art, or in being a social entrepreneur. I didn't necessarily bump into people that were explicitly religious in that sense, but definitely these were people that were working on finding a great sense of purpose and their calling. Yeah, for sure.
I just lost questions. Are you excited about starting Sanskrit study again?
I would love it. I have to go back to India, I think, study Sanskrit. This is not going to be the year when I'm going to be able to do it, because, but going to that course in India, in that ashram, where we start studying scriptures and philosophy, yogic philosophy, I'll be doing it for 10 days. It's going to be an intensive course. I'm so excited about it. I think that I've always been a Sanskrit nerd, I used to love those conjugations and chanting and all of that. So to go back to it, I think is going to be tremendous, It's a very powerful language, and to be able to unlock even some of that knowledge, I think is going to be life transforming.
And how do you, there are so many things, like when you look at Sanskrit and there's 4 words, and then the English translation is 20
I know, it's so succinct.
Do you think, how do you, when you see that, how do you assimilate that ability to see through those 4 words and get all of that?
So first, I'm excited that I'm not going to need a translation, hopefully, once I start studying Sanskrit more earnestly. As much as I think translations are decent and good, I think Sanskrit has very unique syntax, as you just pointed to, because it's a very economic language, it's a very succinct language. The translations, I always gloss over them. I don't know why, and I'll also be very honest with you, and this is the Indian snob coming out of me as I speak this. The delivery of the language is very important. The way it's chanted is very important, because the sounds and the syllables have a lot of, there is the vibrational frequency also changes, right? When you pronounce Sanskrit words in a different way. And for me, it is always disorienting when I am practicing chanting in an American studio or in a European studio, where they're like putting emphasis on the wrong words or like saying things differently. And then I always have this moment when I cringe. and then I'll go ahead and chant. So for me, I actually react more to the chanting and the way people chant than I do to the translation.
I think that's with any different language. Well, maybe you can come back and do pronunciation lessons. That will be your calling. We'll go from studio to studio and teach Sanskrit pronunciation.
Well, it's also because look at the way I talk English. I mean, I put emphasis on the wrong things. And Americans are always making fun of the way I emphasize things. Yeah, I mean, you guys say distributive, and I used to say distributive, and now it's like some mishmash. So it's the same way sometimes when we chant these Sanskrit shlokas, because they will be elongating something that shouldn't be elongated, and they will be shortening something that shouldn't be shortened. So, yeah.
So you do the new book, Nirupa's Sanskrit pronunciation, and it'll have to be a video.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I think we got a lot of good stuff. What I'd like to do is just